what was the music landscape back then for music leading? What attracted you? Can you say a little bit more about, as a young musician, you thought, this is for me, I want to go down that path?
I think one thing that was happening politically at that time, so this was the mid to late 1980s, was, there was quite a significant change. I think perhaps not dissimilar in terms of the seismic nature of the change to what's happening now. It's all relative. But there were big social changes going on, as we know. It was the time of the Margaret Thatcher government, and it's not to comment on that particular government. I think change was happening because
Mm.
it had to happen in so many ways, which was impacting on communities around the country and education and arts and culture. Although I wasn't necessarily aware of it at the time, one key thing was this was a question around the audiences of the future. So what was happening was that there was more emphasis in terms of government funding, on arts organisations and venues, orchestras, etc., saying, who are the audience of the future? What are you doing to reach audiences so that the investment we're offering you, has a sense of longevity to it and building for the future? I mean, that's my interpretation of it. Now, what came out of that was, it probably started more as a sort of marketing exercise, in terms of, well, let's just get more people in. So you look at different ways of communicating that. Where the visionaries came into play, and Peter Renshaw was one of them. There were people like Gillian Moore at the London Sinfonietta or Pauline Tamlin at the Royal Opera House, to name but a couple. They started to play much more into the idea of participation in music making and engagement with music making, particularly with young people, but also with adults. So the idea that it wasn't just an orchestra going out and performing in a context, or indeed bringing young people or adults into a concert hall for a certain type of concert experience. That still remained part of it. The other part was actually the idea of orchestras, and critically players within orchestras, again, very familiar to us now, going out and participating in music making, which was often a creative music making process, which lent very nicely into ensembles such as London Sinfonietta, who are a contemporary music ensemble, performing ensemble. And the other key change going on was in the national curriculum itself. And by the late 80s, the national curriculum, which formerly included music, and stated that music experience, which everyone had a right to and had to experience whilst in primary and secondary school, was around not only listening to music and perhaps doing an instrumental lesson or vocal lesson, but also in composing and performing that music. And this goes back to the timing I was referring to. I came out of the PCS course at Guildhall in 1989, just as that was all coming to fruition, and just as orchestras and other organisations were setting up their what were then called education and outreach programs.
I was going to ask you how easy it was as a freelancer to make a living back then, because you've spoken about how new all this was, and musicians were being engaged and paid to kind of work in pretty traditional sorts of ways back then. I mean, did how easy was it for you to sort of start working in the ways that you suddenly thought, this is what I want to do?
For me, and this is in hindsight, it was relatively easy. I mean, I worked hard, and there were lots of challenges, but there was no shortage of work. And I think that's partly because of what I was just describing. I think this was all just coming into play, and funding was being made available
Mm.
to support projects run by orchestras, or to support practitioners going into school to lead workshops and projects, and to do residencies, such as the composer in education residency I did at Stanford, and that was through the PRS Foundation. So there were lots of initiatives coming into play. It was a very exciting landscape to play into, and I think I was fortunate as a sort of composer performer. I just found my home very quickly. It sort of connected to a lot of things I was interested in terms of what learning and collaborative learning in terms of what co-creativity is about. Those words weren't necessarily being used at the time, but that's what was happening. And I was always interested in, and still am very interested in leadership and what that constitutes, and sort of making new space and looking at the space between, what an orchestra is in the traditional sense, what a school is in the traditional sense, and what you can achieve when you start to explore those spaces. I would also say there was already a very active community art scene and community music scene. It was a full-on freelance life. And then gradually I was asked to start going back into Guildhall from the early 90s onwards to do a bit of teaching and then administration as well.